Hello, and welcome to the keynote conversation for the Yale Centre for British Arts Symposium, Isokon. I'm Rachel Stratton, Postdoctoral Research Associate here at the museum, and I'm delighted to welcome our three speakers, Leyla Daybelge, Magnus Englund, and Juliet Kinchin. I'll begin with Yale's land acknowledgement. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Skiatook, Golden Hill Pagussit, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationships that exist between these people and nations and this land. Before we begin, I've got a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature located on the navigation bar to gather your questions, and they'll be answered at the end of the program. But please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking the icon on your navigation bar. In the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief in my introduction of our three speakers, but please be aware that lengthier bios of all three speakers are available to download on the YCBA website. Leyla Daybelge is an author and broadcaster and a trustee of the Isokon Gallery Trust. She is co-author with Magnus Englund of Isokon and the Bauhaus in Britain in 2019, and Walter Gropius, an illustrated biography from 2022. Magnus Englund is director and trustee of the Isokon Gallery Trust and author or co-author of numerous books about design and architecture, including Isokon and the Bauhaus in Britain and Walter Gropius, both with Leyla Daybelge. Juliet Kinchin is an independent design historian and former curator of modern design at the Museum of Modern Art. Her publications and exhibitions have focused on 20th century design and material culture. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Leyla, Magnus, and Juliet.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear us. As just mentioned, we have done two books, this being the first one and this being the most recent one. And we're here to talk about, to give you a brief overview and introduction really to the Isokon building, to set up the scene for other people to go deeper into the subject.
We'll begin, of course, with two protagonists, Jack and Molly Pritchard, who commissioned the building at the extraordinarily young age of 34. They were part of that small group of intellectuals in Britain obsessed with being modern. They were part of that bright young thing generation in the 1920s, and they met in their first week at Cambridge University in 1920. Jack was studying economics and engineering, and Molly was one of the first women to study natural sciences. She would go on to become a doctor. And they were critically, as I said, obsessed with being modern, being different from their Victorian parents. This extended in their attitudes to politics. That meant being left-wing, being socialist. In their attitudes to personal relationships, that meant having a very open marriage. And critically, in light of what we're talking about today, in their attitudes to architecture and design, stylistically breaking with the past and choosing new and industrial materials. And that period in Cambridge is really critical for the whole success and unfolding of the Isokon story. The contacts and the network which they created there is absolutely critical, beginning, of course, with Philip Sargent Florence, who was Jack Pritchard's economics professor, a young economics professor, who had been to the Werkbund exhibition in 1914 and actually seen the work of Walter Gropius at first hand. And it is he who will go on to be a supporter of Isokon and actually become the first person who sleeps in the Isokon building. He's the first resident as such. And Molly, well, she studies natural sciences, then she does a postgraduate in bacteriology and pathology. Very few women at that stage were working in these fields. She then goes to work in industry for Glaxo in-house as a researcher in castor oil. And then she moves into that most modern of areas of medicine, psychology. There's a brief digression into child education and Montessori along the way, but this is the setting, and these are the worlds which are going to inform these networks, which are going to inform the fascinating network in the Isokon flats.
Jack Pritchard ended up working for Venesta, which was the UK subsidiary of Luther, which was the largest plywood company in Europe between the First and Second World War. Venesta, of course, being short for Veneer, Estonia, and Luther, the family name of the owners. Here is a photograph of one of the several factory buildings in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, that the company owned, where some of the Isokon furniture later would be made. And as part of that work at Venesta, Jack was sent in 1925 to Paris, where they had another subsidiary, Lutherma, where he visited the Paris Fair of 1925. And in one corner of that exhibition, he saw, on the fairgrounds, he saw this building by Le Corbusier and was completely blown away by it. It made a huge impression on him. He returned to Paris in 1928 for the spring exhibition of that year, and walked up to the office of Le Corbusier and suggested to him that, why don't you come to London and do a trade fair stand for Venesta at Olympia Fairgrounds. Le Corbusier was too busy to do that, but he sent his assistant Charlotte Perriand, seen here on the right, over, and this is the result in 1930, with Le Corbusier Charlotte Perriand furniture at the front and using the same tree trunk motif as in the building of 1925. Someone else who had been to that fair was this man.
Of course, it is Wells Coates. Wells, though, hadn't been in the capacity of a designer or an architect. He was actually working for the Daily Express newspaper when he was sent to Paris to cover for a colleague who'd taken some time off. But this was a sort of light bulb moment for him, particularly seeing the works of Le Corbusier and visiting Le Corbusier in his studio. And I know Elizabeth Darling will talk in a lot more detail about Wells, I think, tomorrow. But suffice to say that he and Jack meet through the world of plywood, and this was the sort of what instigated it. Cresta, for which Wells Coates designed the interiors and used a lot of plywood in those interiors, and we see his iconic isometric drawing design for Cresta, from which they took the name for Isokon, the company, which they would set up together in 1931. Of course, he designed the interiors of Broadcasting House, the BBC's radio headquarters. And we also have to remember that radio was a brand new technology at this stage. This is, uncharted waters, but it was his acumen for engineering and his background as a pilot and that sort of cockpit way of thinking, which enabled him to design those very tightly ergonomically organized studios. So in 1931, he and Jack set up Isokon, isometric construction. That's how the name came about. The idea was to build modern houses for modern people, and they had an idea they were going to market 4 isotypes, 4 housing types, and produce furniture. It was going to be a perfectly vertically integrated business plan. This is their first product, the Isokon bookcase. And so the story goes, they got an idea for this from a homeless man who had a pitch at Hampstead Heath Tube Station and who organised his possessions in orange crates.
So Jack and Molly went on to buy the plot of land for £500, which was even back then actually quite an affordable sum. And they asked Wells Coates, after having turned down a previous proposal by Molly's sister and her husband, to do a house. And the first house he designed was this proposal. It's dated 8th of March of 1930, a very Le Corbusier-inspired building. But things moved on from there quite quickly.
Because we should say Jack Pritchard loved everything new and everything modern, and one of his hobbies was filmmaking, and he owned a cine camera, and he made extensive films. We were very lucky when we did our book that the Pritchard family gave us reels and reels of digitized footage that Jack and his brother Fleetwood shot. They actually set up a club called the Projectors Club, and they made their own films. They rented and sold stock to their friends, and they took their camera on travels. They filmed their family. They filmed historic events in London. They also, when Jack decided to go to Germany with Wells Coates and Sergei Chermayeff for March 1931, luckily for us, they took their C camera. And here we have it. The night before, they have been out, they've been drinking cocktails with Eric Mendelssohn. They're all a bit the worse for wear. And Jack shoots out the back of the train, and look where they land up, at the Bauhaus in Dessau. And it's so exciting. When we find this footage, we were, absolutely blown away. It was just in the middle of a lot of other home movie. We can actually see here, 1931, March, the Bauhaus, what it was that really caught their attention. The huge studio wing with its curtain wall of glass, the aerial bridge where Walter Gropius had his studio, the administration building where the theatre is, and then the Preller House wing where the students had their accommodation with the balconies. And they took this footage back. No doubt they pored over it and discussed these ideas. Chermayeff was a great friend of theirs. There are those famous balconies that the students like to socialize on. It was a snowy day. You can almost see their hands shaking. The Bauhaus, there was nobody there at the time. This is March 1931. Walter Gropius is now living in Berlin. And then they make a short walk to the Turton estate, that project of low-cost housing, which Walter Gropius involved the whole Bauhaus in, a little bit like the isotype. There were 4 housing models here, low-cost workers' housing. They built the houses and they produced furniture. And there we see Chermayeff and Coates walking ahead. It's a lovely image, I think. And they also visited the Konsum building, which was a sort of community building on the Turton estate. It had a little supermarket, it had a laundrette, and there was a community recreation area. And they file away these ideas. We don't know for sure, but we can guess that they took these images back to London and showed them to friends of theirs. They were very interested in these pylons. They reappear over and over again. And Molly was originally going to come on this trip, but she was ill. She wasn't able to make it. But there is the Konsum building, and there's a glazed vertical staircase, which we just want to draw your attention to before we come out of the footage. This is very rare, and we're really delighted to be able to share this with you.
So when they come back to London, they throw out Wells' previous idea, and instead they come up with this design here, where you can see elements almost directly lifted from what they had seen in Dessau, including the stairwell tower, and on the back, the balconies, very, very close to what was on the Preller House. But what was inside the building, though, was not Wells Coates' design. It was the designs of this woman.
Of course, it was Molly's idea. And with that very cool, very scientific, very cerebral and logical brain, Molly drew up a brief, and she imagined the ideal tenant for these flats. They ditched the idea of a house. They were going to build flats. This was going to be a young professional man or woman, interestingly, a woman as well, who earned about £500 a year. And that would be about £35,000 in British money, today's money. And the 3 of them, Wells, Molly and Jack, discussed the idea in some depth. And this was how Wells interpreted her idea of minimum living in a serviced apartment, a 25 square metre apartment with a living room with a bed that could be folded up during the daytime. He also, obviously, Jack had been to see Charlotte Perrion's own apartment in Paris. He says he was amazed by this table, he said, that folded away to nothing. And we see a similar sort of table in this flat. This is the Dorland Hall exhibition model flat, which they used to get publicity to help fund the flats.
So in the autumn of 1933, the building started to go up. It wasn't a build without complications, because no one had before built a reinforced concrete block of flats in Britain. And you can see the men here pouring the concrete. And here we are in the spring of 1934, the building near completion. And then the opening day with the opening speech with the local MP, Thelma Cassellett, on the left, doing her speech, and then Molly on the right doing her speech, and you can even see the paper in her hand. And we do have that speech. We have the document still.
We do. And, you know, once again, we just want to draw your attention, as you probably know, it is two women center stage. This is 1934, after all. And it's Molly who gives the speech. And by this stage, of course, the Pritchards have fallen out with Wells Coates. They're very clever, though. Wells is a journalist. He's busy trying to get publicity for himself. But the Pritchards have employed their own press agent. And the event is very well covered by the British press. The story is syndicated and it appears in newspapers the length and breadth of the country. The main angle most of them take is that this is a woman's idea. She only refers, perhaps very hurtfully to Wells Coates, to him as their architect, not even by name. And there we can see Thelma Cassellett cracking open a bottle of beer on the side of the building, Wells standing behind her.
And here we have the famous opening photo taken by Edith Turuhart, the Bauhaus trained photographer who lived around the corner, who had been commissioned by the Pritchards to photograph the opening of the building. And we also have the first photograph of the Pritchards' penthouse flat at Lawn Road, including tubular steel furniture, no plywood furniture at this point, which they have bought from Siegfried Gideon's shop Wurmbedarf in Zurich in Switzerland. We're
Condensing the story somewhat. This is what had happened to the Bauhaus, of course. It had been taken over, or would be taken over, by the Nazis. They used the school as a training academy for the stormtroopers. And Walter Gropius, who's comes to London in May 1934. He gives a speech to Reba. It causes something of a sensation. And as his position is becoming increasingly untenable in Berlin, he decides to come to try and make a new life for himself, a new career in London, helped by Philip Morton Shand, who talks to Pritchard, and they engineer this plan, as you all know, to get Gropius out and to bring him to London. And they arrive at 2:30
on the 18th of October 1934 and move into flat 15. Someone else who also arrives from the Bauhaus is Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who arrives early on the following year. And here we can see them on the 9th of July 1935 at the birthday party at Lawn Road. Jack speaking to Isa Gropius and Walter Gropius standing on the left here.
And that is Sybil Moholy-Nagy and the floral dress in the middle, covering her face. So Breuer takes a little bit longer to arrive. He finally moves in the tail end of 1935. He was at that party as well, as Magnus said. And very soon, Jack Pritchard has, you know, in his brand new apartment block in Hampstead, three giants of the modern movement living there. You know, great kudos, great publicity for him.
And this happened to coincide with that Jack Pritchard visits Finland, where the Luther Company, Venesta, have a factory, as they also had in Tallinn. And as part of that trip, they visit Alvar Aalto and his Palmio Sanatorium. You can see the photograph here with Aalto with the barrier in the center and Jack on the right in his hand. And they also visit the factory, the Coronan factory near Turku, where the Aalto furniture is made. And Jack realizes that his production facilities through Venesta, Luther, is much bigger than that. And he can make furniture as well in plywood. Comes back to London, discussed with Breuer, and Breuer and Jack agrees that they can make this chair that Breuer had designed in Zurich previously into plywood, and this is the result, the famous long chair. And on the back of that, they create a whole furniture program which I'm sure Christopher will talk much more about tomorrow. But it includes the short chair, nesting tables, a dining table. This is actually from Molly Pritchard's clinic off Harley Street, and a dining chair.
Laszlo Moholy-Nagy is pretty well known in London by the time he gets here. He's prolifically busy during his time. He designs for Isokon, of course, this logo of the plywood chair and the sales brochure for the long chair.
But you would think that Gropius would be the one who would get most work. He is, after all, the founder of the Bauhaus, but that is not the case, unfortunately. He does 2 private villas and then Impington Village College, but is turned down for a teaching position and is increasingly frustrated. One of the things that never happens is Isokon 3 in Windsor Great Park, which could have been a huge project for the Isokon company. This is the drawing of it. Unfortunately, the previous 2 Isokon buildings in Manchester and Birmingham, we don't have the drawings of anymore. They were lost in the Blitz. And here we have Impington Village College, which is now Grade 1 listed. So he finally departs in March of 1937. Here we can see them leaving Britain and arriving for taking up his teaching position at Harvard.
Before he departs in Gropius's footsteps, Marcel Breuer designs the famous ISO bar for Jack Pritchard. This becomes the place to eat and to talk, and it attracts an incredible community of residents, artists, architects, journalists, and of course, Jack's great stroke of genius is employing Philip Harbin as the manager and the chef of the restaurant, because he has a huge personality and eventually becomes a household name in Britain.
So without the Bauhausness, Jack turns to Egon Ries, the Austrian architect, to move into the building, who designs the famous Donkey Mark I in the summer of 1939. You can see Alan Lane here on the left, the founder of Penguin Books. But unfortunately, only 100 were made before the bombs start falling and the Soviet Union invades Estonia and confiscates the company where the plywood is made. So here, instead, Egon Ries here on the left has found himself building sandbags against the wall of the building. And here's a bomb map of the area at the moment. Each red dot is where a bomb fell on Hampstead. So it was quite heavily bombed, actually.
So Molly Pritchard takes her 2 sons and they go on a convoy across the Atlantic to avoid the Blitz. She deposits them in Canada, and she herself moves in with Walter and Isa Gropius in their new house in Lincoln in Massachusetts. And Gropius helps to find her work at the Department of Psychology in Harvard. Marcel Breuer, of course, has built himself a house on the site next door, and we can see there he has brought his Isokon furniture with him from London.
Molly returns to London after a couple of years, but in the tail end of 1944, Jack Pritchard also visits Gropius. Here's the guest book, and if you go through the Gropius guest book at Lincoln, there's no other name that appears more often than Pritchard in that guest book. They had a long standing relationship between the 2 families. In 1963, Jack restarts the furniture company, launches the Penguin 2, which is commercially the most successful piece ever made for the company. Jack himself here advertising it. And
in 1968, Walter Gropius celebrates his 85th birthday at Harvard. The great and good from the world of American architecture is invited, and the guest of honor, you can see behind Gropius's shoulder there, are Jack and Molly Pritchard, who Jack thanks profusely and describes as the people who saved our lives. Jack goes and spends the weekend with Gropius in Lincoln, and at that point he decides he's going to travel the world and give a series of lectures on the Bauhaus, which he does the following year.
By 1969, they decide to sell the building, and it eventually ends up in the hands of Camden Council, which mistreats the building to a point where it looks like this. So by the late 1990s, it's completely vacated. There's no one living there, not even the squatters. They've also moved out. and it gets sold to Notting Hill Genesis Housing Trust in the early 2000s, who renovates the building with the help of 100 architects. And this is what it looked after the renovation. This is the Pritchard's penthouse as it looks today. And this is the Isokon Gallery, the museum which we opened in the former garage with the support of the Pritchard family, Wells Coates grandchildren and others. And it's been a great success. We had 26,000 visitors in the 9 years we've been open.
So I realized that was a bit of a gallop through the decades, 1934 up to the present day, but we just wanted to give you a quick broad brushstroke overview, because I think over the next few days people are going to go into a lot more detail. I hope there were some points of interest there. Thank you very much.
Hello, so I'm sorry for the slightly clunky handover there. And thanks, Magnus and Leyla, for that great scene setting to so many of the ideas and individuals and networks that we'll be hearing more about in the symposium. And I wanted to just briefly reflect on my own route into Isokon, particularly in relation to the propagandizing of modernism in Britain and the US, and some of those key players and landmark events or curatorial strategies that sustain those narratives. A light bulb moment for me as a child was being taken by my godparents to visit Gordon Russell's workshops in Broadway, and their house was my first exposure to modern British design, with furniture by Russell, curtains by Jacqueline Grogue, another Lawn Roeder, and Scandinavian ceramics. This was another world, another way of living for me. And later, as a student, I was actually privileged to meet Gordon Russell shortly before he died. But Russell, a huge figure on the British design scene himself, had employed Nicholas Pevsner as his furniture buyer in 1935, and Pevsner began to stock Isokon furniture. And Pevsner and Russell were Isobar habitués, and actually at the Lawn Road 21st birthday party in 1955, Pevsner talked about Lawn Road as a milestone built out of milestones, and a manifesto that really got down to the essentials of modern living without conventions. So the Isokon project's always had these really eloquent supporters, I think, from the outset, and it certainly punches above its weight in larger historical analyses of British interwar architecture and design, or indeed outside Britain too. And you can see how Isokon really fitted the trajectory of Nicholas Pevsner's pioneers of the modern movement, tracing this linear route from William Morris in the 19th century through to his hero, like Pritchard's, Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus. And certainly, I think for Pevsner in 1936, Gropius's presence in London appeared to bring this design reform tradition back to London and Britain, where Pevsner felt it had really started in the 19th century. And it's also a moment when MoMA in New York is also finding its feet as an institution, and MoMA goes on to publish its own edition of the Pioneers of Modern Design. And I think that evolutionary model and ideological thrust of Pevsner's book we'll see and hear more about, I'm sure, from Christopher Wilk tomorrow, was deployed in MoMA's campaign to cultivate an American breed of modernism. And as a design student, design history student, I certainly had to wrestle with Pevsner's pioneers. And as my research interests developed, I became increasingly aware of many of its exclusions, I think, and the rather partial nature of the narrative, which was also being elaborated by Morton Shand and Herbert Reed and others at this moment. And when in the 1980s and 90s, I was immersing myself in Hungarian design in a research project with Hungarian colleagues, that began to give me a rather new perspective on architect designers like Erno Goldfinger, who'd designed the Gordon Russell showroom, who was a Hungarian emigre like Moholy Nagy and Breuer. And I became fascinated by looking at emigre designers, many of them of Jewish heritage, and thinking about the kind of skills and cultural knowledge that they were bringing from their countries of origin, and how, you know, Isokon products or ideas could achieve many different meanings or resonance in different locations or at different times. But also, I think how certain emigres became seamlessly absorbed within this very Western-centric canon, while others, particularly many of the women, found it much more difficult to penetrate this canonical reading of the modern movement. I'm thinking in particular of Otti Berger, who studied at the Bauhaus, was strongly promoted by Gropius and Moholy Nagy and Breuer. She was another ethnic Hungarian, actually from Croatia, a weaver who found it very difficult in London, and actually described the modern movement there as a snob thing. But, you know, that really helped me see how many practices were being kind of really marginalized in this narrative. And you can't fail to be aware of the kind of gendered narrative in Osbert Lancaster's pitching of modernistic versus functional, the pipe smoking functional architect on the right, whereas popular taste and feminine taste is really mapped onto the modernistic. I mean, even the pets are gendered, the modernistic cats and the functional dogs in this scene. And certainly at the same time, I was looking at Charles Rennie Mackintosh in relation to Margaret MacDonald, and Morton Shand actually was very resistant to the idea of Margaret MacDonald's work being shown alongside her husband's, because he felt that she was just pulling him back, restraining the modernist impulse. And that it's a very kind of persistent bias. And I just wanted to take it forward a bit with another Lawn Roader. Paul Riley actually stayed in the Lawn Road flats. He had two tenancies and had worked alongside Pritchard at Venesta before he again moved in to the heart of the design establishment in the 50s. And this is the male expert talking to the rather witless female consumer. Don't be deceived by superficial glamour, as if they had little creative input themselves. But certainly going back over the Atlantic to America, Lawn Road was making a star appearance as early as 1937 in an exhibition on modern architecture in England, organized by a woman, Ernestine Fantle, who was the first and only woman to head the Architecture and Design department at the Museum of Modern Art. And I've been particularly interested in her role recently. Then, as now, affordable housing was really topical, and Fantle had worked as an assistant on the international style exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art in 1932, in which Britain was nowhere to be seen, really. But she did pursue the housing themes with her friend and collaborator Catherine Bauer, one of the other more hidden women in narratives of the modern movement linked to MoMA. And she got Catherine Bauer to write about modern housing in Britain for the catalogue of this exhibition. So Fantle came to London in the summer of '36 and did really impressive footwork. She was largely ferried around by Wells Coates to all the great sites. She managed to buy a huge number of photos, including this one with the help of the Architectural Review, for MoMA's collection of architectural photography. And she got permission to use some of Lancaster's satirical cartoons and commissioned a film of the Tecton Zoo design from Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. So she was really very deeply immersed in these kind of circles, and Gropius really helped her research as well and invited her to be the US representative to a SIAM meeting of international architects that year, where she met up again with a lot of the Mars Group English architects. And so she actually, Alfred Barr was really excited by this project and supported it because he saw these signs of rapid progress in Britain as really a model for America to follow. And he and Fantle were also deputized to try and nobble Gropius to come and take the chair of architecture at Harvard, and possibly even to design a new building for MoMA. That didn't happen, but as we know, Gropius did in fact decamp to Harvard in 1937. It was a really life-changing kind of experience for Fantle, because in the process of all this research, she went native, as it were. She fell head over heels in love with this brilliant young classicist and bibliographer, John Carter, and they got married this is them on Boxing Day, 1936. And shortly after the exhibition, she left MoMA and went to start a new life in London. And I like to think she was perhaps waving mid-Atlantic to Gropius, moving in the opposite direction. But although she didn't include any Isokon furniture in that exhibition, Isokon pieces, as you'll see from this sample of MoMA's plywood collection, are really key to the evolving collection in this area, and also to MoMA's collection of prefabricated design using plywood technology. And in the middle, you see of the Isokon pieces, I added one for the Frank house in Pittsburgh, a piece that was a house that Gropius and Breuer designed, and it was very closely related to Isokon furniture for the Ventris apartment at High Point in London. So this almost seamless transition from Britain to America. And the most recent acquisition that I was proud to be able to help shepherd into the collection was actually Jack Pritchard's own copy of The Donkey. And a shout out to James Zymatis and Alice Tish for helping me get that into the collection. But actually, you can see how Isokon really became wrapped into MoMA's advocacy of contemporary design right from 1939, when the new building was opened. And in the MoMA penthouse, it was almost like an isobar club, if you like. MoMA members could relax and eat and chat and look at small exhibitions and experience the materiality and functionality of this contemporary design at first hand. So I think that was really important because it was a means of really introducing people to this range of contemporary industrial art and craft. And that trajectory then really continues in, and you'll hear more about this, I think, from Christopher tomorrow. But you see here how the Breuer Isokon furniture has been wrapped into this evolutionary narrative, starting from William Morris and Tonnet and through the tubular steel furniture of the 20s to Alvar Aalto's furniture and then Breuer's. This was an exhibition organized by Elliot Noyce, who actually presented to the museum the two chairs you see there. And really that narrative was preparing the way for the advent of American designers. And you can see that they were the designs, prize-winning designs, which really launched the careers of Charles and Ray Eames and Eero Saarinen, were pitched as a kind of riposte to the three-piece, really bulbous upholstered chair, which was presented as a zoological specimen, which devours little children and pencils and all these bits and pieces, but is far from distinct. And then Serge Shamayev, who'd been such a feature of Isokon in London and a feature of British modernism in London, actually here is drawn into, he emigrates to the States as well and curates the design for use, which again takes the plywood experimentation of American designers forward, just at the moment, of course, when Isokon and Gerald Summers' Simple Furniture are actually coming to a close. And the last in that kind of trajectory, Edgar Kaufman Jr., and another curator who was so involved in promoting plywood and Alto and Isokon and the Eameses in a series of exhibitions. Again, you can see Isokon being wrapped into this sequence. Kaufman did this small, largely photographic exhibition of modern rooms of the last 50 years, for example, illustrating both British interiors by Breuer and Isokon and Breuer's house in the States as well. And then by the time of the International Low-Cost Furniture competition in 48 and the house in the museum garden by Breuer. You know, Breuer and plywood have become absolutely part and parcel of the MoMA message about good design. So these are some of the themes and individuals that we'll definitely be exploring. But I just wanted to end with maybe a prompt to a discussion looking at Ernestine Fantle, by then Mrs. Carter, with her friend, another American expatriate, Lee Miller, whose partner was the surrealist artist Roland Penrose, and the kind of sociability and convivial modernism that they developed, particularly around Farley's house, which was the East Sussex home of the Penroses. And you can see there Wells Coates a little filled out by this stage in 54, actually in the kitchen of Farley's house. And this was a time when both Lee Miller and Ernestine Fantle were producing cookery books, you know, so for them, this kind of cookery and food was a really kind of an art form and a form of performance art, really. But I wondered if we could, Magnus and Leyla, if we could perhaps draw out a bit more of these ideas around food and sociability in the Isokon project, because certainly, you know, food is just such a big recurrent theme. Shall I come out of the screen? I don't know if you can.
Yes, I don't know. Can you hear us now?
I can hear you.
Wonderful. Yes, we would just pick up on what you were saying, of course, with the 500 Club being the kind of starting point, official starting point, I guess, for this idea of conviviality and food and great conversation and getting together. And I was just having a look before we came this evening at a typical seating plan from one of these 500 Club dinners. I think it was the one hosted by Raymond Postgate, just to sort of have a cross-section of the sorts of people who were sitting around one of those tables. And it's just so interesting. We have Postgate, who, of course, goes on to become the editor of the Good Food Guide, but was a famous conscientious objector and a member of the Communist Party. We have some of Molly's friends, medical friends. We have Eva Hargraves, who's a highly regarded anaesthetist working at University College Hospital. Theodora Alcock, who we don't really know her name now, but she was actually responsible for bringing the Rorschach test to Britain, that standard by which, you know, all early psychological tests, the inkblot test, were used. We have Gropius, we have Issa, we have Philip Harbin at the other end of the table. We have Fleetwood Pritchard, who, of course, has got a really progressive advertising and marketing agency. And, you know, the balance of men and women, interesting men and women, is pretty evenly matched on both sides of the table. And also what a fascinating conversation they must have had, you know, psychology, medicine, politics, design, Breuer's there as well, but all united by this love of food.
Yes, and certainly some of them were even gourmet, weren't they? I mean, Morton Shand was writing books on wine and food, and growing special kinds of apples, and I think Wells Coates too. He was quite the chef.
Yes, I think his parents, as part of his rather unique education, made sure that he knew how to cook and serve Japanese dishes that were specially taught by a Japanese cook. And he loved to entertain in his Knightsbridge apartment, and in that little hearth scene that he created where everybody sat on the floor, he would serve food Japanese style. He
also appears later in the early 50s in consumer magazines, sort of at home with Wells Coates, how to cook, and he shows off. And he seems to have, particularly with his knowledge of Asian cooking, which was probably quite unusual at the time. I think he was a bit of a showman with that he could do that sort of thing. He liked to impress people by showing that he could cook in the Japanese way.
But also these menus, you know, when you go to the University of East Anglia and you go through those papers, and they have every menu from the ISO bar, and you look at the kinds of foods they're eating that Philip Harbin and, you know, his predecessor created. They were not, this isn't just, you know, modern architecture, modern design, it's modern food. They're eating very progressive kinds of dishes.
And also, rather like Alexander Calder designing the table setting in the MoMA penthouse, or Moholy-Nagy designing the you know, the menu cards. You know, so it's bringing in other art forms as part of the process. And I think that was one of the things about Lee Miller's working guests at Farley's house. So she recruited, you know, Henry Moore. Well, she recruited Alfred Barr to deliver pig swill, and Ernestine, you know, the Carters were treating woodworm in some of the furniture. But I just came across this wonderful review of Pevsner's Pioneers of the Modern Movement in 1936, when Christopher Cornford said, "Good design is like cold rice pudding, plain, nutritious, high-minded and off-white." And that seems to run so contrary to the very kind of colorful and kind of succulent flavors of the Isokon isobar.
Yeah, and it didn't stop just with the food. Of course, they also had advisors on the wine menu. It was quite an extensive, quite an exclusive wine menu, mainly French wines, of course. And Jack Pritchard had very specific ideas about which ales to serve. It wasn't just any old beer to be served. It had to be certain ales. And they even had a Cuban cigar menu, which was quite extensive, actually. It wasn't just 1 or 2 cigars. It was 5 or 6 different types of hand-rolled Cuban cigars.
I was also struck by another film that Moholy-Nagy was making in London on lobsters, and actually the flyer for that is the figure of a lobster overprinted on a menu, and really interested in this whole ecological perspective of where our food comes from, you know, how we should really honor it and enjoy it. I think that was very much the thrust of that film.
It's probably difficult for us today to imagine the standard or the low standard of the food at the time, of course, and they were sort of rebelling against that. And it was, some dishes are dishes which are like Turkish kebabs and spaghetti bolognese are not that sophisticated today, but they would have been really unique at that time. But these are people who had traveled, of course, they had been to the continent, and they had seen that there was something else out there, something better, and they were aiming at that.
And those menus that they created for the Half 100 Club, the invitations, they were a little sort of intellectual game in themselves. You had to think of a theme for your dinner. Then you had to, some of them wrote their invitations in poetry. You had to come up with some, you know, clever new way of presenting what your menu was going to be, and then you had to cook it yourself. And it's just funny what Magnus was saying, because I think one of the dinners is the worst British menu ever. It's the idea is that the dishes are the worst kinds of dishes that you would have at the worst kind of English hotel, but these will be cooked in a new way, a new, more delicious way.
To me, that sounds as though it prefigures the kind of fluxus experimentation with food and menus, again, as an artistic practice in the 60s and 70s. But really, really fascinating.
Another favorite, of course, is the one with the Julian Huxley with London Zoo, where they all have to sign a non-disclosure agreement because they're actually consuming food sourced from the zoo, including an antelope, which probably wouldn't have gone down too well with the general public if they would have known about that.
No, I imagine not. But certainly, in a way, I think it also fits with some of Molly's scientific knowledge and interests as a biologist, amongst other things. And I mean, I really think these areas like food also, although they were involving so many of the men too, really do point to a different kind of creativity in which many of the women were so skilled and knowledgeable. And I think there is so much more that I hope we will find out about Molly's role in the whole Isokon project and many of the other women around the edges of it. You know, they don't feature in these big pioneering canonical narratives, but clearly was so formative.
I think Jack really was quite a strong champion of Molly. I mean, he really continually made the point that his point, as he saw it, that it was Molly who'd had the idea for the flats. I mean, he's still writing letters to publications right into the 1980s to correct people about this, that it was partly thanks to Molly. And there are, as we know, there are interesting and strong female figures in the story. We have Beatrix Tudor Hart, we have Edith Tudor Hart, the Bauhaus trained photographer. We have Agatha Christie living in the building, of course, the most successful novelist of the 20th century. We have Eva Collett Reckitt, who owned a very influential left-wing bookstore in the centre of London. Magnus, you know about some of the women involved in espionage?
No, yes, of course. We had the Kaczynskis, Red Sonja, who certainly was a woman who had her own will involved with the recruitment of Klaus Fuchs, who gave the atomic bomb secret to the Soviet Union. So the spy network, which is a fascinating part of the story, certainly had several
and the political differences and animosities, as well as passionate friendships and affairs that really hold the whole thing together. Yeah.
I guess that in terms of research, we have the entire residence list from 1934 up until the sale to the New Statesman. And I mean, there are many, many single women living in the Isokon flats, some of whom, some of whom have got Wikipedia entries. I guess the problem is that many of them at this stage in their lives, because they're living in the minimum flats, they are unmarried. And so they go on, they marry, they change their name, and we can't always follow them up. I mean, there's probably a lot more research which
perennial problem.
Yes.
Yeah. And that list seems to have been drawn up by Jack Pritchard in the 1960s from memory. It's not done year by year. So there are gaps and there are mistakes in the list. And as part of research, it would be good to compare it with other records of taxpayers' records and voting records, that sort of thing, to see what else can be found out. There's certainly more research to do on that front, I would say.
I thought I would just join in your conversation rather than kind of having a very separate Q&A, just because there have been some questions that have been relevant to the discussion, and given time constraints, it would be great to just bring them into the conversation now. So we had a comment from Christopher Wilk about convivial modernism being a wonderful concept, which it is, and whether you could, on the subject of food, which you were talking about just a moment ago, whether you could share with the audience Gropius's outspoken views on the food in England, which apparently he was not impressed by.
No, he wrote a very scathing letter back in the his first winter in London. He was very unimpressed by that. It was a very, very bleak winter in 1934. The flat was cold with, the metal windows. There wasn't great central heating, and they had to spend a small amount of money they'd be given as a gift by the Elmhursts on an electric heater to sort of increase the heating in their flat, and a cover for their bed. And he wrote, I think it was to Martin Wagner, and said, I don't know how they put up with it here. The English, it's ridiculous. The weather is terrible. There's so much pollution from these coal burning fires, and the food, the food to top everything. It's just ghastly.
And there's another question which was also, I think, sparked by the discussion around food, but actually sort of has a wider is kind of wider interest, and that's the background of all of these people that you've been talking about. Were they all independently wealthy? Where were they getting the money from to do all these modernist ventures?
I think.
Well, I mean, the residents of the building, I would say, were certainly middle class, not working class, but neither were they upper class. I mean, they were, as Molly had in her brief, £500 per year income, £35,000 per year today. So they purposely went after that sort of people. But also a lot of them that arrived, of course, were refugees. That's the other thing. And they had no money at all whatsoever. They really arrived with the clothes they stood in and a suitcase in their hand. But the wider circle, of course, with Huxley and the members of the Half Hundred Club, they had money. Yes, they had money.
Yes, and John Carter, whom Ernestine Fantle married, I mean, he had that kind of the same Mandarin background from Eton and Cambridge, and I mean, not hugely wealthy, but certainly, comfortably off.
Mm-hmm.
The preachers themselves were never that wealthy, and they run into trouble already when they were building the building, because they couldn't finance it. They had to take out a loan at quite a bad interest rate. Actually, it was quite costly, and they run out of money towards the end of the building project. And much later, in the early 80s, Jack was interviewed and asked, was it a profitable venture? And he said, no, it wasn't, because we ate the profit we ate in the isobar. That's actually his explanation. We spent the money, any money we made, we spent. And he refers specifically to the isobar then.
I mean, I think it's interesting that it's so much about how we create patterns of meaning through design, through the objects we use, the spaces we inhabit. So in a sense, I feel the charge of elitism can hold true without necessarily being wealthy. I mean, it's how you really choreograph those social relationships through design that make it an often closed closed club, despite its very democratizing agenda.
Well, it's also, I think, it's a charge against the London clique of London modernists, like you mentioned with Otto Berger, and the lack of success of modernism outside London. It really was quite a snobby clique, and that point had been raised at the time also by other people. There seemed to have been a conflict there. I can think about even some of the modernist architects themselves rebelled against it towards the end.
But we could sort of also argue in a way about the sort of slightly democratic presentation of some of the furniture. We have Gropius and Jack Pritchard going along to Peter Jones and John Lewis to advise them on sort of displays to advertise or to display modern furniture on their ground floors. Some of the furniture is Isokon furniture. So there we have on Oxford Street, you know, every man is walking up and down Oxford Street, and they are seeing modern furniture in the window of the shops. Then we have the Isokon book donkey being marketed in collaboration with Alan Lane, and the Penguin book is the sort of the ultimate symbol of making literature available and affordable in a small, cheap, paperback form. So I think some of the ideals are slightly confused, but the intentions are also there to make this. You know, Jack and Molly clearly believed that modernism in the initial stages would materially improve the lives of ordinary people, as many of the modernists did.
And you could see the whole IKEA phenomenon as very much part of the legacy of that kind of experimentation and making it genuinely accessible to a much wider and very international audience.
I think that is in fact a really great place to end, at the kind of democratization of this form of modernism through IKEA. Thank you very, very much to all three of you, Leyla, Magnus, Juliet. This has been a really wonderful and rich discussion, and we hope that you'll contribute to the discussions tomorrow as well. And thank you for everyone for tuning in. And just to say that the symposium, the second day of the symposium, will start tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. So hopefully you can translate that into whatever time zone you're in. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.